Hello, and welcome to CBP's first virtual trade week. I am Valerie Newhart with the Office of Trade Relations. I will share that I have missed the many in-person engagements with our industry partners. And as Acting Commissioner Morgan mentioned yesterday, our engagement and our partnership with our partners remains a priority, especially during this virtual time. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, who is a true advocate for trade, facilitation, and enforcement and the free-flowing movement of cargo, Executive Assistant Commissioner in the Office of Trade, Brenda Smith.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's session of CBP's Virtual Trade Week. We are delighted to have you join us to talk about the future of trade and optimistic that our pivot to a virtual approach will give us a chance to share our thinking and to have important conversations. Please engage, ask questions, take notes, and follow up with us. We appreciate your tuning in, and I know that we can count on your expertise and your opinions. Welcome to all of you. As we get started today, I'd like to review our current operating environment and then give you a sense of what we will focus on in the next 5 years. When I think about the current trade landscape, two characteristics come to mind: change and complexity. In a global environment of rapidly advancing technology, shifting economic relationships, and new business models, it is impossible to ignore just how dynamic the world of trade is. The last decade has been no exception. 10 years ago, we started to think through the concepts behind the centers of excellence and expertise, while simultaneously working to define the role of the customs broker. We also caught glimpses of the power of the data we collected about transactions, but were frustrated by the limits of our technology. Since that time, the centers have become a reality, and we have, finally, issued proposed rulemaking about the role of the broker. We will continue to refine the requirements around this critical responsibility. 5 years ago, we worked through the mandatory transition to the various capabilities within the automated commercial environment, or ACE. The government and the private sector worked hand in glove to build and test new software, provide operational guidance, and implement process changes. And we had our fingers crossed the whole time that it wouldn't come crashing down around our ears as we transitioned from our legacy automation into the brave new world of ACE. We also started to see what our congressional stakeholders had in mind for CBP as they proposed the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, which was signed into law in February of 2016. In its final form, TFTEA contained over 100 new mandates for Customs and Border Protection. After its passage, the change continued as a new administration used its trade authorities to send a very strong message to some key international partners. Trade became front-page news, and we adapted automation and business processes on the fly, while working to ensure that supply chains functioned effectively. Effective supply chains became even more important as the world locked down in response to a global pandemic. The American public recognized how much they depended on e-commerce for everyday basics, another change that has worked its way into our economy over the last 10 years. Communities also realized the importance of smoothly functioning supply chains as they stocked up on masks and hand sanitizer. This is a tremendous amount of change in a relatively short period of time. But it's not just the pace of change that has challenged us. It is also the complexity of the issues we have to manage. Let me give you a few data points to remind you of the intricacies we work with every day. CBP enforces nearly 500 laws on behalf of 49 partner government agencies. 539 anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders address conditions of unfair trade. 16 trade agreements with 21 countries have been implemented to smooth and grow trade between our strategic partners. and over 17,000 unique tariff codes govern the way we transact trade. The complexity doesn't end there. Let us look at the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which we implemented in the midst of this pandemic. Trade deals like USMCA help to create an open, competitive international marketplace. They promote regional economic integration and build shared approaches to trade and investment between trading partners. While the USMCA will ultimately simplify many aspects of daily trade, adjusting to a new agreement of this type after operating for a generation under NAFTA certainly adds a new layer of complexity for many of us. As I tend to be a glass half full kind of person, I've been grateful over the past few months that we have used our past experience to build our muscle memory. Investing in trade infrastructure like flexible automation, our human capital and expertise, and reimagining and modernizing business processes has presented challenges, but it also has built the foundation from which we manage our complexity and even, maybe, thrive in the midst of change. So, where do we go from here? At CBP, our vision for the future is to create processes that are more streamlined, secure, and digital from end to end. Much of our vision resides in the 21st Century Customs Framework, or 21 CCF, which has been developed over the last 24 months with lots of input from internal stakeholders, other government agencies, and across the trade community. Our goal is to propose a legal and operational framework that will transform the trade landscape for a generation, embracing technology and a sophisticated understanding of risk, while including new actors and business models, and being flexible enough to accommodate future change. If you're signed up for our session on Friday, you'll have a chance to go deep on the whys and whats of the 21st Century Framework. For now, let me give you a few insights into what we're thinking. Imagine a world of seamless data sharing, a world where manual data entry is a relic. We have been working to make more data available through ACE, which allows you and us to layer on better data visualization and analytics so we can harness the power of our data to make better decisions about the opportunities and the risks in front of us. One of our greatest challenges over the past decade has been the exponential rise of e-commerce. We envision a world in which e-commerce is smooth and transparent for all parties, so that CBP can better facilitate compliant, low-risk trade. We've learned a great deal from the challenges that e-commerce has presented, particularly in the opportunities it presents to those seeking to circumvent our trade laws. To that end, we also envision a world of intelligent enforcement, a key component of 21 CCF, using an intelligence-driven enforcement approach to go after the bad actors whose actions threaten the economic well-being of our businesses and the health and safety of American consumers. CBP uses intelligent enforcement to improve the agency's ability to anticipate, identify, and address threats to legitimate trade. We've already begun using data to do this. The future, in some ways, has already arrived, and we are embracing its possibilities to do our jobs better. To be able to realize our vision, at CBP, we realize that we have to invest in our people. We've proposed a dedicated Trade and Cargo Academy at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Charleston, South Carolina, to grow our trade personnel, keep them up to date on 21st century business practices, and to ensure that we are as expert as you are around the rules and tools with which we do trade. We hope that we can entice some of you to come and teach at our academy or in our virtual classrooms. I can imagine a world where all of this resides at the click of a button, and I think after the 21st CCF panel this week, you will also be able to imagine that world. Now, let me spend a few minutes on the topic of today's first panel discussion, which is forced labor. In 2016, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act raised the profile of CBP's long-standing authorities to exclude goods made with forced labor and to penalize offending importers. The International Labor Organization estimates that forced labor generates $150 billion in profits annually and affects 25 million people. The pervasive scale and scope of forced labor practices globally is one of the top challenges the Office of Trade faces from an enforcement perspective. We've learned a great deal over the last few years. Most importantly, that this is a very complex problem, requiring the coordinated efforts of many organizations and individuals to identify unfair labor practices and to address root causes. We still have a great deal of work to do together. CBP cannot combat the importation of goods made with forced labor alone. We are working collaboratively from the government perspective to provide information and to identify the most significant risks. But we also need U.S. businesses to proactively monitor their supply chains to mitigate and address the risk of importing goods produced with forced labor. One way to do this is through publicly available information and reports provided by the Departments of State, Labor, and Homeland Security, and various non-governmental organizations. I know that today's panel will provide further insights and information, so thank you for joining us. And thank you for continuing to work with us throughout our journey. This year, we celebrated the 231st birthday of the Customs Service, reminding us of our history, our challenges, and our evolution. I believe that a critical factor in that evolution has been the partnership between the government and the private sector to build a system which recognizes and realizes the potential of international trade. The terrain we work on will continue to morph and change, leading us to develop new solutions, new tools, and new strategies to address unprecedented opportunities. Together, we can tackle the exciting challenges and complexity of an evolving trade landscape to ensure economic security and prosperity for the United States. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and I hope you will enjoy today's panel discussions.
Good afternoon. My name is Ana Hinojosa, and I am the Executive Director for Trade Remedy Law Enforcement Directorate within the Office of Trade. And today I get the great honor to be able to serve as your moderator, or as the moderator for this important panel. Before I start that panel, I have a few important administrative announcements I have to share with you, and then I'll go straight into the panel. For those of you participating, at the bottom of your screen, you will notice 3 icons. One of the icons is for resources. There you will find a one-pager with information supporting today's discussion, along with biographies for today's speakers. You can also find information on the Trade Week webpage on cbp.gov. You will also find the closed captioned icon at the bottom of your screen, as today's session is being closed captioned as well. Participants may submit their questions throughout the session, and we will answer as many as we can before we end the session. I know that we started a little bit later than anticipated, but we'll do our best to be able to address as many of the questions as we can. I am very pleased to be able to moderate this panel. Not only is forced labor an area of responsibility for me, but also it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and one that I've certainly spent the last 9 months working to ensure that we're doing the best job that we can on behalf of the American people, on behalf of American businesses, and in executing our responsibilities. So with regards to today's panel, I couldn't be more pleased to have a diverse yet mutually complementing panel for today's discussion. Our panel today will include, and we'll start off with Ambassador at Large John Richmond. He is with the U.S. State Department's Office monitoring and combating human trafficking. I'm sorry. Let me stop for a second. Ambassador Richmond is with the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons with the U.S. State Department. And his office puts together the annual Trafficking in Persons report. And I'm sure that we'll hear a lot more about that when he's able to speak to us. He's a wealth of knowledge in this area with regards to human trafficking and forced labor. And so we're really pleased that he has been able to make time to be with us. Unfortunately, he will only be with us until about 2:25, 2:26, something like that, because he does have another commitment that he has to jump on at 2:30. But I think between now and then, we'll need to maximize and optimize our time with him and get as much of his experience and feedback as we can on this very important topic. Also on the panel today is Deputy Undersecretary James McCammett from the Department of Homeland Security. He is the Deputy Undersecretary for Strategy, Policy, and Plans, as I mentioned, with DHS. And he is also serving an important role with regards to the USMCA Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. And you'll get to hear a little bit more about what DHS is doing in the area of forced labor, and in particular, some of the activities with regards to the USMCA Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. Mr. McCammett has a broad scope of responsibility, and we're very excited to have him share some of his efforts and some of the ongoing work that the department is doing. Also, as part of our panel is Sarah Bessel. Sarah is the Deputy Director for the Human Trafficking Legal Center. The Human Trafficking Legal Center does amazing work, and most recently, they published a very comprehensive document on the issue of forced labor. And so we're happy to have Sarah here to speak a little bit about what the Human Trafficking Legal Center is all about, and some of their efforts with regards to forced labor, looking at the issue of forced labor from the non-governmental civil society organization perspective. One of the reasons why I think this is going to be a very interesting panel for all of us is that, as I mentioned when I started this, the participants, the panelists on today come from a number of different perspectives, and I think that together will complement and bring a very rich discussion. And so my next panelist is Brian White, and Brian is the Director of Global Compliance with the J.M. Smuckers Company. And every time I get a chance to speak to him or to say his title, and I think of the J.M. Smuckers Company, I always get hungry, because it always takes me back to jams and jellies that I enjoyed as a child. And Brian, of course, does a lot of work on behalf of Smuckers, but also participates on our COAC committee, and is a wealth of knowledge, and will be bringing to us the private sector perspective, in particular the trade community's perspective as it relates to forced labor. So we are very happy to have Brian on this panel. Not only is he a great gentleman and a great professional, but I think he truly is passionate about this topic, and very knowledgeable, because he has been focusing on it for quite some time. And so very happy to have Brian on this panel. And last but definitely not least on this panel is Keegan Mull. Keegan is the trade counsel with the Committee on Ways and Means in our U.S. Congress. So Keegan brings a great deal of experience on what Congress has been thinking about and what legislators are thinking about, and in many of the challenges. And I know that he's spent quite a bit of time on this committee, and can certainly share with us some of the thinking pre-TFTEA, and then also, some of the areas of concern, and maybe some of the other areas of interest from the committee, and maybe from other members as well. So Keegan has a very strong background in this area and understands the issue of forced labor very well. And so, again, very different perspective, or very different direction that each of these panelists will be coming in. And so I'm excited to be able to serve as your moderator, and hopefully enable this to be an interactive and interesting panel discussion. So just to kind of give us a little bit of a panorama, and before I invite our first speaker, I wanted to share with you a little bit about forced labor. I know that Executive Assistant Commissioner Brenda Smith, in her keynote address, spoke a little bit about the global problem of forced labor. One of the areas that our forced labor division works on, and she mentioned, EAC Smith mentioned that in trying to address the problems of forced labor, it's extremely important to collaborate with other agencies of the U.S. government. But even beyond that, we certainly collaborate with the private sector, with the NGO and CSO community, as well as it's important for us to work with the international organizations. And so we work very closely with the International Organization on Migration and with the International Labor Organization. And in particular, with regards to the International Labor Organization, we very much guide ourselves by the information that they provide, and really use the standards and the forced labor indicators that they have identified and have put forward as those indicators that any person who is employing workers or investigating cases of forced labor would want to look for particular indicators or particular conditions that could indicate forced labor conditions. Currently, the ILO has published 11 indicators, and I'm hoping that we'll hear a little bit more from Ambassador Richmond on his experience on the ground and some of the things that they're seeing. But I'd like to just very briefly go over what these forced labor indicators are. I'm not going to go in depth into them because I know you don't want to hear me all afternoon. I know that you want to hear our fantastic panelists, but I did want to make the point that when we're talking about forced labor, we are talking about human beings who are being subjected to some incredible human rights abuses in their employment, and so these particular indicators are, for example, abuse of vulnerability. In some cases, that could be related to people's education level, people's exposure to information, people's lack of understanding of what their rights are. In some cases, it could even involve limited capability to understand some of the terms and some of the contracts that they're being asked to sign. Illiteracy sometimes also leads towards abuse of vulnerability, where workers are being forced to sign commitments to things that they certainly can't read what they're signing. Restriction of movement. Workers are imported, that's the wrong word, but are brought to other countries to work, to serve in different positions, and they're not allowed to move throughout the country. They in some cases their identification documents are confiscated, and they're not allowed to leave certain compounds or other limitations. Withholding of wages, deception, hiring people in one country or one part of the country and telling them that you're hiring them to do one thing, and painting a really nice picture, and then when the worker arrives, the conditions and the situation is much different than what initially brought them to that workplace. Isolation is another forced labor indicator. Physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats in the workplace. Retention of identity documents, I spoke of that as well, and it goes hand in hand with, in some cases, with restriction of movement if that intended movement is trying to leave the country. Debt bondage. This is a huge one in a number of countries where migrant workers are brought into that country to work, but they're required to pay quite a bit of money in advance, and of course they don't have that money, so they end up having to work under a debt bondage situation. Abusive working and living conditions. We've seen in our investigations some really atrocious situations that these human beings are being expected to live in and work in, and these then result in the products that come across our borders for our consumption. And then excessive overtime is also one of the forced labor indicators. I think that we as Americans think of excessive overtime as you're having to work an extra hour every day, but the conditions in some of these countries are really serious, and people are being expected to work, in some cases, 12 to 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and in really terrible living conditions and working conditions. And so the reality on the ground is very serious, and I think that it's an important cause for all of us to work on, and I'm really excited to have this conversation and to have each of these wonderful panelists be able to give you their perspective. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of how the panel will work. I will be inviting my individual panelists to share a little bit about their work and provide maybe 5 to 7 minutes of an overview. Maybe I'll ask them a question at that point, and then we'll move on to each of the panelists, because I think we have some great information. I do want to make it a little more interactive, and so we may relate one panelist to another after they've spoken, if there's a question that we can ask that will help enrich the conversation. So I hope you're ready. I certainly am. I'm looking forward to this panel. And if Ambassador Richmond has arrived, I'd like to invite him to start us off by sharing a little bit about the work of the Office of Monitoring, of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Ambassador Richmond.
Please proceed, Mr. McCammett. Ambassador Richmond is not yet online.
Okay, thank you. Well, we were going to pivot then. I'll provide my remarks, and we look forward to the ambassador being able to join us if possible. First of all, Anna, I want to thank you for leading this discussion, and thank you to our DHS CBP team for hosting today's virtual event. I'm very happy to join my colleagues from State Department, Congress, the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and Smuckers as we all seek to discuss the efforts being undertaken. This issue of human trafficking and forced labor is one that has strong interest from our Department of Homeland Security, and also my own strong personal interest in addressing these actions and violations of human rights abuses, including across the 11 indicators that Anna mentioned. On Monday, we commemorated Labor Day to celebrate the incredible achievements of American workers, and those achievements include more than economic outcomes. They also include social outcomes and recognizing the rights and values of the American worker. Workers globally deserve basic rights, freedom, and dignity, and millions of men and women each year fall victim to human trafficking. The United States cannot stand for serious human rights abuses overseas. We simply must do right by our longstanding American values. And we must do right for American workers by creating a fair international trade system. As EAC Smith had mentioned in her remarks, it's a sad fact that over $151 billion a year pour into the economy from forced labor. Unfortunately, the U.S. law protects not only American workers from forced labor, but also protects the United States from benefiting from forced labor anywhere in the world. The goal of enforcing U.S. law that prohibits the importation of goods produced with forced labor is, simply put, to prevent forced labor overseas. So we need U.S. companies to take their due diligence very seriously. If companies merely see the prohibition on importing these illicit goods as a cost of doing business, then forced labor overseas will continue, and the United States government will have failed our mission to end forced labor globally. Companies in the U.S., therefore, should examine their supply chains for any trace of forced labor goods and then remove it immediately. If not, our department, the Department of Homeland Security, may certainly pursue civil and criminal consequences. If the U.S. government finds those goods in the products we buy, then our suppliers may face suspension and debarment from U.S. government contracts. I have mentioned we've discussed a bit on the role of Customs and Border Protection, but I also do want to note the role of ICE and Homeland Security investigations, in specifically Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, Homeland Security investigations, which also has a critical role in this mission by investigating criminal violations of our law. Any person or entity, whether an importer, retailer, online marketplace, or certification company, for example, who benefits from participating in a business venture, knowing or in reckless disregard that the venture engaged in providing or obtaining forced labor anywhere in the world may be subject to criminal prosecution. Well, having set that top line, I want to say as well, it is wonderful to see widespread public appreciation for the efforts across the administration and for our own department's authorities and programs to combat goods produced with forced labor. Trade enforcement is a critical element of a holistic national security strategy. And so in thinking about the Department of Homeland Security and thinking about national security strategy, I want to make sure and emphasize that point of the interrelationship with trade enforcement. Earlier this year, our office, the Department's Office of Homeland Security Strategy, Policy, and Plans, established a brand new component dedicated to trade and economic security policy. Simply put, to guide the department's growing role in this aspect of promoting Homeland Security through trade and economic security, further supporting and hopefully force multiplying the efforts by Customs and Border Protection, by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and by our partners in the interagency. So my participation today in this panel is part of a wider campaign by our department's leadership to deliver the message that we want private industries and the public's support and engagement and further engagement toward ending not just forced labor, but also all forms of human trafficking and child sexual exploitation. Our ICE Homeland Security Investigations has continued its partnership with the civil society organization to identify additional sources of information regarding allegations of U.S. importation of goods produced with forced labor. ICE HSI has also enlisted contract support to aid in compiling and analyzing data to identify indicators of businesses' potential involvement in forced labor. So for the department, moving forward, we will review any recommendations provided by the Forced Labor Working Group of U.S. CBP Custom and Border Protection's Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, which, as many of you know, or I hope you know, is composed of representatives from the business community. These are great examples of public-private engagements that benefit the mission of DHS, the National Security Mission, the Trade and Economic Security Mission. And DHS is committed to transparency and public engagement on this issue. As Anna kindly mentioned, just last month, I had the privilege of taking on a new role in my capacity as Deputy Undersecretary for the Strategy, Policy, and Plans Office. That's specifically chairing the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force called for under the USMCA. Our members include the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the Departments of Labor, State, Justice, Treasury, and Commerce, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. In addition, the National Security Council and Domestic Policy Council participate as well. As mentioned, our task force is required by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement Implementation Acts, Subtitle D on forced labor. Now, this was signed into law of January of 2020, so just the beginning of this calendar year. Our task force then was established in May of 2020 when President Trump issued Executive Order 13923. Now, the law states that the task force will monitor U.S. enforcement of the prohibition on importing into the United States goods produced anywhere in the world with forced labor. This task force provides its participants with updates regarding active orders to detain goods produced with forced labor at the ports of entry, ongoing investigations, petitions received, enforcement priorities, and other relevant issues. So far, we have held 2 quarterly meetings of the task force, according to our appropriate calendar. The task force is working on the near-term requirement to establish timelines for responding to petitions submitted to the Commissioner of CBP, alleging that goods are being imported by or with child or enforced labor. Now, meeting this requirement and providing this information to the public is critical to establishing reliable standards and upholding a commitment to transparency. I do want to then, as I pivot to close, note in one particular instance in a country which is practicing these practices. DHS has read the numerous public reports on American household brands supplying from factories in China that advertise their participation in the Xinjiang camp system. The Chinese government has been arbitrarily and spuriously detaining 1 to 3 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims and ethnic minorities in these camps in Xinjiang province. And they have been subjected to forced labor, among other serious human rights abuses. As the Departments of Treasury and Commerce have already made clear, the Chinese government's security apparatus, including the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, the XPCC, generates revenue from the forced labor in these camps and holds financial stakes in numerous Chinese companies benefiting from this forced labor. China's state-sponsored forced labor does continue outside of the camps in Xinjiang. Minorities are forced to work under the threat of being sent into these concentration camps, surveilled and further abused. And these detainees of the camps are then sent to work in factories all across China against their will. Now, I believe you are aware that the U.S. government, we have warned businesses of the risk in July when the Departments of Homeland Security, State, Commerce, and Treasury published the Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory, and then notified hundreds of corporations' executives. Simply put, no matter the location in the world, companies should not violate U.S. law, and furthermore, companies should not subject the American consumer to suffering the ethical consequences of purchasing illicit goods produced with forced labor. If any part of a product is made with forced labor, the whole product is considered produced with forced labor, and therefore cannot be imported. DHS aims to play a role among many U.S. government agencies and our colleagues in trying to save the lives of many victims of state-sponsored abuses and violent crimes overseas, while also protecting and upholding the integrity of American values, prosperity, and the rule of law. So I'm proud that the Department of Homeland Security works closely within the administration and our other U.S. government agency partners to leverage our combined authorities to eliminate this inhumane activity. In closing, I would just want to say again, I thank you for the opportunity and to share with you some of the background on our Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, some of our efforts and our close monitoring and commitment to addressing forced labor abuses overseas and continue to work closely within our U.S. business community as well to address this. I want to thank you again. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues and as well, if we have time, questions that our audience may have regarding these ongoing efforts, which I mentioned. Thank you, and Anna, I will turn back to you now for our next panelist.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. Really appreciate your contributions and your work. In the interest of time, I will be coming back to you for some questions, but I know that we do have Ambassador Richmond here, and we have him for a very short period of time. So I want to make sure that we give him a good opportunity to share with us his work and to give the audience a chance to ask any questions. I'll remind everyone that you can submit your questions through the Q&A box, and we look forward to receiving those. But without further ado, Ambassador Richmond, please take the stage.
Generally, zooming out a little bit, and I really appreciate some of the things that James shared about some of the specific tools. But to zoom out a bit, just to talk about what forced labor is and what it looks like around the world. Right now, we're seeing forced labor as a form of human trafficking. The governing legal definitions are clear. They come from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the UN Palermo Protocol, the protocol the UN had to abolish trafficking in persons. But the reality is the phrase human trafficking has become an umbrella term or a category term for all types of individual harms. They include forced labor, but also includes sex trafficking. And so when we talk about forced labor, we want to talk about it in context, not just as it might have been defined in the early part of last century, but as it's actually defined under the governing international instruments of the UN protocol. And trafficking is all about people and choices. So when I think about trafficking, I think about who are the people involved and do they get to make choices? The first group of people that are involved in trafficking are always just the traffickers. And they can be individuals, they can be small groups, they can be gangs, they can be companies, they can be recruitment agencies, and they can be an employer in any industry. They can even be governments. And this year, the Trafficking in Persons Report identified 10 countries where the government itself was acting as the trafficker. Those governments include China, North Korea, Russia, and Cuba, where the governments were engaged in state-sanctioned forced labor. This can affect global supply chains. And traffickers' primary motivation is economic. And some might have other motives too, but their primary motivation is always illicit profit. They want to expand their margins by not paying their workers at all or by paying them less than the free market allows. But traffickers have a problem. People don't want to willingly work under such conditions. Forced labor is an affront to capitalism because there's nothing in it for the worker. And this is where traffickers get to exercise their freedom to choose, because traffickers have choices. Where your company recruits you through competitive compensation, a sense of mission, opportunity for advancement, or robust benefits, traffickers recruit and maintain their labor force through coercion. And that brings us to a second group of people involved in this, victims. And victims are simply people who want to work. And they're often in vulnerable situations due to poverty, education, migration, disability, legal or illegal debts, or many other things. Traffickers like to target vulnerable people because traffickers think they're easier to coerce. And traffickers generally want to use the least amount of coercion necessary to compel their victims to labor because coercion requires the trafficker's time and resources. The coercion works to deny the victims the opportunity to make choices. Traffickers intentionally try to eliminate the ability of victims to make the choice to quit their job and compete in the free market for employment elsewhere. And so traffickers don't want people to know about their crimes. They especially do not want third parties and people of goodwill to know about it. Traffickers know that, like them, customers have choices. And most customers, whether they're other businesses sourcing produce, parts, or products, or they're the ultimate retail customers, they don't want to buy things tainted with forced labor. So customers may legitimately want a bargain, but they don't want human trafficking. So traffickers work to keep their illicit operations secret. If someone sniffs around, they disregard the concerns as mere administrative violations or labor rights abuses, issues that they consider minor and that all businesses struggle with. Companies that are acting as traffickers might seek half-measure remediation efforts that might modestly adjust working conditions but don't disrupt the heart of the coercive scheme. Like painting rotten wood, they try to make things look better, but they're unwilling to deal with the underlying problem. And so the State Department, with the rest of the federal government, uses tools to try and improve the ability of individuals, of businesses, and of governments to identify forced labor and stop it. We do it through monitoring and reporting. If your company sources from a country and you are not taking the time to read through the trafficking profile and the country recommendations in the tip report, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. There's a lot of great information there. We also do it through sanctions. In addition to the narrative component of the Trafficking in Persons report, we also have tier rankings, and the lowest ranking triggers sanctions on the governments. In addition to the TVPA's Tier 3 restrictions, the U.S. government uses trade checks, visa restrictions, and other sanctions to ensure that businesses or others who knowingly benefit from forced labor are not allowed to thrive within the U.S. market. Treasury, the Department of Commerce, the Department of State have the ability to place sanctions on travel restrictions for individuals and businesses involved in forced labor. And then there are administrative actions, and everyone here understands Custom and Border Protection's Civil Trade Authority to detain and seize goods produced with forced labor at ports of entry. These withhold and release orders increase the risk for companies, forcing people to identify if there is supply chain problems, if there's forced labor in their supply chain. We're very encouraged about the increased use of WROs, these withhold release orders, over the last several years and the leadership that it represents. But in addition to the administrative findings, there's also criminal liability. We have criminal statutes in the United States that can hold companies accountable for benefiting from a forced labor venture. And this is true even if the company was not actively engaged in recruiting, grooming, or coercing workers. If the company knew or recklessly disregarded the fact that forced labor was going on, they can be on the hook. In addition, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States has a civil remedy, and individuals and companies can be sued for human trafficking violations, and people are using this important civil tool. The Human Trafficking Institute cited a 125.6% increase in the human trafficking civil suits in 2019, and they were about evenly divided between forced labor and sex trafficking. So the landscape has shifted. This year is the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the modern anti-trafficking movement. Since 2000, awareness campaigns about these crimes have generated a legal framework to stop trafficking. We're now seeing the shifting landscape that as those laws are being applied. Attention and enforcement actions are increasing, and they will continue to do so. This is a fight about people and choices, and we want to return the choices to forced labor victims and hold traffickers accountable for dragging our supply chains into their criminal schemes. And as always, as the State Department, we want to be available to you. So please feel free to reach out with questions or to engage our office. We want to make sure that the United States continues to advance its values of freedom and liberty around the globe. And I'm glad to be with you today.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have a couple of questions already that I think would be from the audience that I think would be helpful to ask you while your presentation is fresh. One of the questions is, are there specific industries that are affected by forced labor? So I'll ask you that, and we look forward to your response.
Yeah, I think there are industries affected by forced labor, and they vary. The industries are chosen by the trafficker. It's in which industry the trafficker chooses to operate. And so we see lots of forced labor in agricultural facilities, brick mills, or rice mills, brick kilns. Certainly, we see it there. We see it in factories and manufacturing facilities. We see it in hospitality. The industry is only limited by the trafficker's ability to criminally innovate. And so I think as we look at what we're sourcing as companies, what we're bringing in, and where in our supply chain we might have vulnerabilities, I think we should assume that it could be in any industry. And we should look for telltale signs. If a lot of the workers are in significant debt, if recruitment fee structures haven't been shifted so that the employer pays the recruitment fee and not the employee, we have a signal that there may be a problem. We also want to look for where people aren't free to leave. If someone's not free to go home when there's a death in the family, if someone can't travel freely, or if their documents are being maintained and kept in a third location away from the worker, we have a signal that there could be a problem. The challenge is that this could occur in any industry. And so we have to be vigilant because the trafficker is in control of that choice. We're in control of our choice to make sure we're vetting our entire supply chain.
Great. Thank you very much. I know that you're going to have to leave around 2:25, but we'd like to keep you on for as long as we can, because I know that we have some more presentations from our colleagues on the panel that will really sync up well with your experience. And I know that there's some more questions from the audience that you may be the right participant along with others on the panel to respond to. So thank you for your presentation. Before I go on to my next panelist, who's Sarah Bessel, I'd like to first ask Mr. McCammett or James to answer a question. One of the questions from the audience was, can you repeat the number of, I'm sorry, let me look at it real quick. The question was, can you repeat the value of forced labor importations into the U.S. From your earlier remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Anna. And I believe I'm echoing also what EAC Smith had noted. This figure may need to be further updated, but I know that the International Labor Organization in 2014 had assessed the annual cost profits of forced labor to be more than $150 billion. So I think if you factor in subsequently economic gains, reductions, gains again, where things have been in the economy recently, that certainly is a very safe number and quite likely even higher. But again, International Labor Organization 2014 or 2015 report, and you'll find that there.
Great. Thank you very much for that. One other person, and I'll open this question to either Ambassador Richmond or to James to answer. And if neither one of you know, I'll jump in and answer the question, but I think they'd rather hear from you. So the question from one of the audience members is, how many other customs authorities worldwide are leading efforts to cut forced labor? And is there a list of those other customs authorities that are working on forced labor? Ambassador Richmond? He may have had some connectivity issues. James, do you have that answer?
Well, I am familiar with several of those that we're working with, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. But I think, Anna, you're not doing yourself, you're doing a disservice to take yourself out of that answering. especially both on the level of the partnerships and, quite frankly, the number of initiatives. So let me defer back to my colleagues and to you, if that's okay, Anna.
Thank you, James. So the answer to that question is that, to our knowledge, the U.S. is the only customs administration that actually has border enforcement authority for forced labor violations. There are many other partner countries that we're collaborating with. There are many countries who have publicly expressed their strong commitment towards eradicating forced labor. But many of those countries are handling their enforcement of forced labor violations either through their labor departments or through their trade ministries, in dealing with either compliance with their trade agreements or domestic labor enforcement. But so the answer to that question is, currently the U.S. is the only country that has a border enforcement authority for forced labor. So thank you.
And if I may, to echo and support what CBP has been doing, you've modestly noted it, but DHS CBP has really been a leader in working with other countries, not only, as you note, with some of the efforts and representations that are made publicly, but also within all the right bounds, encouraging changes, in laws that can also have a similar effect. So, as you know, still very much the only country so far, but just want to give that kudos and appreciation for what CBP is doing in that regard to help support other countries in their efforts.
Thank you, James. I'd now like to go ahead and invite Sarah. Sarah Bessel is, again, the Deputy Director for the Human Trafficking Legal Center. I'm sorry, I got too excited, Sarah. Sarah Bessel is the Deputy Director for the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Please share with us your great work, the great work of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon to everyone. As Anna said, I'm Sarah Bessel, Deputy Director of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, a human rights organization that focuses on strategic litigation to eradicate forced labor around the globe. And I'm happy to be here today to share the NGO perspective on how these trade enforcement efforts are impacting the situation on the ground, the opportunities that NGOs see for systemic change, and talk a little bit about our Tariff Act practice guide, which Anna so graciously mentioned. So yesterday we were welcomed the news of a potential new WRO on the Xinjiang Uyghur region. And this comes 1 week after the Human Trafficking Legal Center and US and UK groups petitioned CBP to block cotton textiles from the Xinjiang Uyghur region. And this comes 2 months after a coalition of more than 180 civil society groups released a global call to action asking brands to disengage and stop sourcing cotton from the region. And this is in addition to 3 WROs against hair products and garments from the Xinjiang Uyghur region. So we see that Section 307 of the Tariff Act has the power to create systemic change, because we know that forced labor, it's a feature, not a bug, of global supply chains. It's a system where brands want to maximize profit at the lowest cost, putting pressure on importers to get cheap goods now, which then puts pressure on producers to pump out cheap goods at an even faster rate, and who might look the other way when recruiters recruit workers and may or may not charge recruitment fees. It's a system that prioritizes the bottom line and not the worker. So we are encouraged to see the increased enforcement under Section 307 of the Tariff Act. And we think it's such a powerful tool that we created a practice guide to educate NGOs on how to file a 307 petition with CBP. It's publicly available on our website at htlegalcenter.org. And we're having the guide translated into multiple languages so that workers, unions, and worker rights advocates around the world can access it and file their own petitions. We're also using the guide to train lawyers and workers' rights advocates on the ground globally. And we know of at least 8 petitions that have been submitted to CBP by NGOs since 2013. And these are just the ones that are public. NGOs have petitioned CBP to halt the import of cotton from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and recently the Xinjiang Uyghur region, but also palm oil from Malaysia, cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire. And as a result of these petitions and self-initiated investigations, CBP has or is investigating palm oil in Southeast Asia, forced labor in the Uzbek cotton industry, tomatoes from Mexico, coffee from Brazil, and cocoa. And in fact, following the NGO petition to CBP, CBP issued a 25-part questionnaire to cocoa companies, interrogating them on their supply chains right down to the farm level. So we're starting to see an initial impact. For example, on the ground in Malaysia, there are reports that the WRO issued against subsidiaries of Top Glove has really been a wake-up call to the rubber glove industry in Malaysia. And this is an industry where forced labor has been well documented by the media and civil society. Workers in the rubber glove industry are forced to pay thousands of dollars in recruitment fees, forcing them into a situation of debt bondage where they have to work to pay off those high interest rates. And in addition, those workers in the rubber glove factories face wage theft, delays in overtime payment, illegal salary deductions, substandard living conditions, a host of forced labor indicators, a host of the forced labor indicators that Anna mentioned in her opening remarks. So following this WRO, Top Glove did announce that it would move quickly to remedy these abuses, and we're encouraged to see that. In fact, last month, Top Glove agreed to refund workers $12 million in recruitment fees. But we would caution that the repayment of recruitment fees is not sufficient. It's not enough, and it does not begin to address the level of abuses suffered by workers. So we're encouraged also to see that Top Glove appears to be addressing other labor abuses, such as improving housing conditions for their workers. We're also hearing reports that the industry and the government of Malaysia is now reassessing systemic issues like excessive recruiting fees and debt bondage that were previously considered to just be the normal course of business. The government of Malaysia is reportedly auditing Top Glove's recruitment system and implementing a national electronic wage monitoring system. Should these come to fruition, this has the potential to be real change. And beyond WROs, we were encouraged to see that CBP recently imposed a $575,000 civil penalty on importer Pure Circle for importing stevia products from China produced with prison labor. And I would note that the investigation into stevia was based on information submitted by an NGO. This is the first penalty that CBP has issued for imports made with forced labor, but we hope it won't be the last. And the human rights community looks forward to more and higher penalties against US companies. As has been said earlier, it's not enough to punish foreign producers through WROs. In addition to withhold release orders, there needs to be civil penalties on importers. And human rights groups are pressing for criminal prosecutions that target those who import goods made with forced labor. The bottom line, you can't hide behind your supply chains anymore. And there is a duty to investigate and to conduct due diligence to ensure that you're not bringing in goods made with forced labor into the United States, because NGOs are doing investigations and now CBP is investigating as well. So what opportunities does the NGO community see for the near and distant future? Well, NGOs have worked for decades to close the consumptive demand loophole. And since that closure, there have been 19 WROs issued and counting. We are excited to see an increase of government scrutiny on the import of goods made with forced labor. And as Anna mentioned earlier, it's not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. We're seeing interest in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and other countries enacting similar types of Tariff Act bans. We're starting to see a Tariff Act ripple effect. And NGOs support enforcement against producers, importers, and those who financially benefit from forced labor. This is an opportunity to shape remediation in a way that takes into account the worker, that worker in the factory in Malaysia. Ending forced labor requires companies around the globe to respect labor rights more broadly. Workers have the right to organize, to unionize, and to report abuses. And so how do you do that? Well, companies that seek to end forced labor in the supply chains and who seek to really create systemic change and progress have to implement remediation that's more than a Band-Aid, that includes workers, not just company management or third-party auditors, but remediation that is informed and verified. by workers, as well as corrective action plans and due diligence plans. This is really an opportunity to tackle the structural causes of forced labor in supply chains. Because as I mentioned, forced labor is a feature of the system. It's not a bug. Today's workers are no longer enslaved through physical chains, but through threats and debt and the abuse of the legal process and all the other forms of coercion that Anna mentioned. To paraphrase Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we can't simply bandage the wounds of workers beneath the wheels of injustice. We have to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. And the Human Trafficking Legal Center and other NGOs are hoping that robust enforcement under the Tariff Act and other trade tools will do just that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that was a very robust presentation. I'm wondering whether you've received any feedback from other NGO colleagues with regards to your publication on importing freedom. I know that it contains quite a bit of recommendations. Could you speak just a little bit about some of the areas that for which recommendations are included in your publication?
Yes, I'd be happy to. The NGO response has been very positive. We've received a good amount of inquiries from NGOs around the world who want to learn more about the process and potentially develop their own petitions. As we know, in the United States, it was an opaque process to begin with, and so we're hoping to make it a little more transparent. In terms of the recommendations, there's a host of recommendations in the practice guide, and I won't bore you all with going through that laundry list, but essentially, I think the bottom line is to put workers first. So when you're submitting a petition, at the end of the day, is this something that will benefit the workers who are being subjugated to forced labor conditions? And I would craft a petition around that underlying ethos.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. I have a question from the audience that I'd pose to either yourself or Ambassador Richmond to weigh in on. And the question is, what would you like to see from independent third-party audits as way of best practices? So maybe we'll start with Ambassador Richmond. Do you have any thoughts on that, or Ambassador Richmond?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad when companies try to engage a third-party auditor. I think that could be a helpful snapshot. A couple of things that come to mind for me is we want to find auditors that have actually located human trafficking victims before, that they know what to look for. So just being a compliance person, just having done work in employment law or labor law, I look for a little more specialization, a little more experience in actually figuring out where human trafficking exists. The second thing I'd be thinking about for audits is the longevity of the audit. A one-day audit that only interviews current workers is going to give you very little information. Audits need to be conducted over a longer period of time, weeks, if not months. We need to interview not just current workers, but former workers, vendors, workers from vendors, trying to think about how you would go about investigating. What sort of surveillance monitoring about trying to figure out who's coming and when they're coming, where the workers live, figuring out what they eat, where they go, what sort of freedom of movement they have. I think that audits have to be more than just reviewing a company's business records. They need to be an actual investigation. Because what we're not trying to identify are workplace violations. We're not trying to find unsafe conditions. We're not trying to find where someone's not getting paid overtime. All those would be interesting indicators. We're going to gather up that information. But the goal here is to fight human trafficking, is to fight forced labor, not just generally make workplaces nicer or better. We want to get to the heart of this crime. Obviously, we want workplaces to be better in all of these ways, but we're not just about that. We're actually trying to find something that is dark and it is hidden. And it's hidden because traffickers that are out there hiding it. I'd love to hear what Sarah's responses are, though.
Great. Sarah?
Absolutely. So I would say that, off the bat, the NGO community does have a good amount of skepticism about the audit industrial complex. So right out of the gate, you have to ensure that these are not check the box audits. And I would reemphasize the fact that you have to include workers and unions and worker rights organizations. So as Ambassador Richmond said, you have to dig deeper under the surface. Well, how do you actually find that information? you consult the workers and you actually check and verify with them that the audit is actually matches up with their reality, because we've heard many stories where the reality of the workers is very different from the reality of what a clean audit looks like. So at the end of the day, again, I would say incorporating workers into your audits, incorporating workers in terms of verifying those results and getting additional information and evidence is really the way to go.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Ambassador Richmond. I know that you're going to have to leave for your next meeting. Please accept my appreciation for you taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us today, and we'll certainly reach back out with some of the follow-up questions that the audience directs your way.
Wonderful. It was great to be with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up on our panel, I'd like to invite Brian White to share his perspective from the private sector and from the importing and trade community. As I mentioned, I'd love to introduce Brian because I get to say the J.M. Smucker's Company, and that's always sweet. So, Brian, away.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for the kind opening remarks, and absolutely stay hungry for Smucker products. We love it. I'm also here to represent the trade community in terms of what we're doing in forced labor and really highlight some of the challenges that are there. And forced labor remains a top of mind for the trade community. And CBP has made great progress enforcing Section 1307 with an increase of the withhold release orders this year. And the announcement, as Sarah had mentioned, the first civil enforcement action under the provision. And there are some that see this as a negative, but I truly think this is the cause for celebration. At the end of the day, as it was highlighted earlier, this is a humanitarian issue. We're talking about people in supply chains and their livelihoods in the communities and where they're living. And these enforcement actions are helping to raise awareness to the seriousness and the scale of the human rights abuses that are occurring throughout the world. The trade community is committed to eliminating forced labor in supply chains. It acknowledges our collective responsibility to ensure that our supply chains and our business partners are free from any form of human rights abuses. Forced labor is a crime, and most manifestations of forced labor is at the hands of criminals. As Ambassador Richmond was saying, it's likely that human traffickers that are there, and they're highly skilled at covering up their tracks, which makes modern day forced labor that much more difficult to detect. And it's not a matter of walking into a facility and seeing people physically restrained or being abused. Instead, we're looking at these indicators we've been talking about, the ILO indicators like wage garnishment, deception, restriction of movement, and debt bondage, all of which could lead to a case of forced labor. So for us at Smucker, we began first addressing human rights in our supply chain when we learned of a report that fishermen in the Gulf of Thailand were being held against their will at sea and were subjected to inhumane working conditions. We immediately began to engage our supply chain partners to address the findings that were 6 layers deep in our immediate supplier relationship. We had no influence and no control over this supply chain. And I think there's a perception among the US government agencies that trade has a fully connected supply chain using blockchain or maybe another slick technology that allows visibility to the deepest points in their supply chain. And true, depending on the commodity, that very may well be the case. But in most cases, it's a significant challenge to gain access to deeper levels. So in most cases, engagement at the first and second tier is quite common, but it's difficult for importers to develop that traceability and to have the appropriate leverage to access working conditions at these deeper levels of the supply chain. There are also examples where actors at these deeper levels are intentionally blocking importers' efforts to seek transparency and address the issues, and it's likely because they're a part of that problem, which requires additional digging. As James highlighted earlier as well, we've got cases of state-sponsored forced labor, in addition to the lack of consistent enforcement of the existing laws for human rights. U.S. government agencies must continue to engage in these top-level diplomatic and trade interventions to ensure consistent application of the existing regulations, as well as developing the additional legal frameworks related to protecting human rights. There's also a need for continued partnership and further investment in supply chain traceability. One example is the Department of Labor. They have the Bureau of International Labor Affairs recent grants of $8 million. These tools are intended to improve downstream tracing of goods made by forced and child labor. And I think that's something that we have to continue to develop and get better at as we look at truly addressing this issue. We view this, at Smucker and many of my peers as well in the industry, we view it as a pre-competitive issue. And we acknowledge that it requires industry-wide solutions, partnerships with civil society and public-private partnerships to gain deeper visibility into the supply chain and make a meaningful difference. Most U.S. companies have extensive collaborations with global multi-stakeholder initiatives to collectively address forced labor risks in supply chains. Some examples include the International Labor Organization's Global Business Network on Forced Labor, AIM Progress, the Consumer Goods Forum, the American Apparel and Footwear Association's Social Responsibility Committee, the Seafood Task Force, among many, many others. I think if you're interested in learning more, I would really encourage you to read the COAC Industry Collaboration white paper that was made public in July. Within that appendix, we've identified over 80 unique initiatives and organizations working with businesses to address forced labor across the globe. These initiatives represent a wide variety of tools and resources for importers to leverage as components of a sophisticated, risk-based due diligence program. In terms of Smucker, we participate in several industry organizations that are working to address forced labor. Last year in Chicago, during the trade symposium, I provided an overview of our responsible sourcing program where we have human rights due diligence processes. And I also summarized our involvement with the Consumer Goods Forum and the Seafood Task Force. Honestly, the most effective and meaningful progress we've made has been through collaborating with other companies that have a shared supply chain. So we've established an MOU with several pet food industry organizations where we collaborate and we're sharing resources to address labor practices in the seafood sector. This engagement has been a successful partnership to conduct Thai flag vessel assessments in the Gulf of Thailand. We've also developed a remediation fund to help to implement meaningful remediation activities based on the findings of this assessments. This allows us to engage our supply chain partners with uniformity, avoid the audit duplication, and ensuring that we can verify the practices and the working conditions at the deepest levels of our seafood supply chain. Most companies that are out there have similar CSR programs that are working to identify, monitor, and remediate forced labor in the supply chain. And I was happy to hear Sarah really point out this focus on remediation that's informed. It's based on the worker's voice. What are we learning from this information? And again, importers may identify indicators of forced labor, but it may take weeks or months of extensive investigations to determine if there is actual forced labor. And today, under 19 U.S.C. 1307, these remediation programs are technically a violation of the law, and they would suggest that these companies be prosecuted. However, these are good practices, and without these practices of good remediation and meaningful, sustainable remediation, we wouldn't make any traction in the efforts to address forced labor globally. So if a company discovers an indicator of forced labor, it's important to stay engaged. Continue to use your leverage to support that remediation of the issue rather than cutting and running from these suppliers. If U.S. importers are encouraged to exit a supplier as a result of a potential indicator of forced labor, or if there is a withhold release order against a supplier, it could lead to diverting the goods into other markets and also continue to encourage these forced labor practices. So in addition, while we talked about remediation a bit, I'll shift and talk again about the company's CSR programs that are set up to identify, prevent, and mitigate human rights issues. At the end of the day, the question still remains, will these programs be enough to demonstrate proof of admissibility should the products be subject to a withhold release order at the border? That still, I think, is to be determined. I think there's a lot of questions around it. The COAC Forced Labor Working Group, we put forward several recommendations over the last 3 years, requesting additional clarity on proof of admissibility requirements, the evidentiary standards, the need for and the acknowledgement of meaningful remediation, among several other recommendations. And we're hopeful that the pending notice of proposed rulemaking will help to bring clarity to many of these issues and modernize the regulations related to forced labor enforcement. As you've heard from many of the panelists today, this is a very complex issue, and it's great to hear the enthusiasm around partnerships and working with the government agencies. I think we've seen a lot of collaboration among the government agencies and civil society. There needs to be more collaboration among industry and trade with the government organizations, civil society, to make meaningful change in this area. So Anna, with that in the opening remarks, I'll turn it back to you, and we could take it from there.
Great, Brian. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions that I think would be good for you to answer. One of the questions is, what are some of the recommendations you can provide to companies who depend on sourcing of components for manufacturing? There are currently a number of denial screenings, which are one of the ways that industries ensure trade compliance. What can be other directions industries can adopt to ensure compliance in the supply chain area?
That's a great question. Thank you, Anna. And again, your OFAC screening, what you're doing for denied parties is not enough, right? That's just looking at the publicly available databases. What you truly have to do is make sure you're doing proper due diligence of those facilities that are actually providing those components to you. As Sarah mentioned earlier, it's not enough to just go in and do a one and done social compliance audit. It's important that you engage with the sites that you're working with, that you have knowledge of, meet with the workers, get the workers' voice, get the management voice, really understand the full spectrum of the working conditions in that environment to make sure that you have a level of comfort with their operations, their management, and what you're hearing from the workers that helps to ensure that there's no potential for forced labor in those products being produced.
Great. Another question that I will ask, and I think that Brian, you should be able to answer this from a trade perspective. What are the risks for companies that have imported products made with forced labor, even if the companies were not aware that the factories were using forced labor?
That's a great question. So following a withhold release order you has past imports, Customs does have the authority to issue a redelivery notice for those products where they have evidence that the goods may have been produced with forced labor in the past. So that is the risk. And ultimately, when you look at the recent enforcement actions, you could also be subject to a penalty if you had knowledge. I think as Ambassador Richmond pointed out, if you have knowledge that there may have been forced labor included in the production of those products or components.
Great. Thanks a lot, Brian. There's a couple more questions that I think might be in your area of expertise. But before we hit those questions, I really would like to give Keegan a chance to present his perspective, and then we can kind of have an interactive dialogue and make sure that we all get into the conversation. So without further ado, Keegan Mull, Trade Counsel with the Committee on Ways and Means.
Note, just need to note that the views I express today are my own and do not reflect the official position of the Committee on Ways and Means. So as I started, I about putting the forced labor conversation in context from the Hill perspective. You know, for a very, very long time. Aggressively has centered around our trade agreements and our trade preference programs, with where the focus has been on ensuring in the environmental space and across the board to ensure that those standards are being met. And so we've been that the standards in our preference programs are effectively enforced to ensure that we're raising standards there. So that has been one key area, and one key area where there's been a lot of focus on the Hill and in the media. But over the course of the years, members have been interested in looking at other tools, including purely domestic tools. There's a long history there as well, including, on the environmental side, there's the Lacey Act from 1900. Of timber. So the equivalent in my it provides an incredibly strong remedy, and I think it's about as strong as it gets in the trade space. Obviously, prohibiting the importation, but I think that also reflects the severity of the harm that is inflicted on the victims of forced labor, and how much we need. And the sort of disincentives we need to be putting in place to ensure that goods made as a product of forced labor do not enter the stream of U.S. commerce. So as many of you know, and as has been discussed today, there was a lot of attention around this provision in TFTEA and the customs bill that was focused on in 2015 and 16. Consumptive demand loophole, I think, highlighted that existed in forced otherwise strong prohibition. And so there was, as a part of TFTEA, there was a strong drive that achieved broad bipartisan support to close that loophole and to make it a clear ban on. That was a big key turning point, I think, for the on what the U.S. approach on forced labor is going to be. And I would say since TFTEA has passed, Congress has turned its attention to implementation and enforcement. This is, a lesson from all of our trade agreements and our preference programs that you can have standards in place, but the key is really ensuring that you are following through and making sure that you have monitoring programs and you are devoting the resources to ensure that the provision that you put in place is actually effective. And so that's has shifted, and on forced labor, effective enforcement of a broad prohibition is particularly difficult, mainly because the problem is so pervasive and in so many different regions and countries in the world. We've had some, Ambassador Richmond highlighted from the Department of State's perspective in the TIP report. You can see how pervasive it is. You can look at the Department of Labor's, multiple reports on forced labor to see and how countries this is a serious issue, and so figuring out an effective strategy on that front and an effective enforcement plan has been understandably difficult. I think there have been growing pains from the congressional perspective on watching the federal government ramp up its enforcement efforts. It had been, dormant for at least, 15 years or so, and had not been particularly actively used. So we were coming from a space where it was not a tool that was very aggressively used. And immediately after TFTEA, we saw a short burst of enforcement actions under the Obama administration. And then I would note that, 2019 and 2020, as you can see through the WROs, and the fine that was recently issued, we are seeing increased enforcement activity. I think the desire from a congressional perspective is to see that continue to ramp up and to how big of a problem this is. And so perspective is that there are a number of different agencies that are focused on this. I mentioned the Department of State and the Department of Labor. Obviously, DHS is playing a key role, the Department of Commerce, and there are others, and each have devoted to figuring this out. And I think there was a desire from the congressional side to try to harness all of those resources and ensure that we could the full weight of the U.S. government to guide some of those resources and that expertise into enforcement of Section 307. So as we've been following implementation and opportunity, the USMCA implementing legislation, which has been mentioned earlier, the USMCA, tying it back to the beginning of my remark, increased the labor standards, and that included forced labor. The USMCA has the strongest forced labor provision in it of any of our trade agreements. I think the hope really is to create a continent that is free of imports coming in through forced labor, and certainly forced labor going on in the continent itself. It's an aspirational goal, but the rules are there in the USMCA. As we were looking at it from a congressional perspective, we wanted to make sure that we had the domestic tools in place and enforcement strategy in place to ensure that we were doing our part as the United States to effectively ban the importation of forced labor. And that was the impetus behind setting up the forced labor. The idea there is to bring all of the agencies that I mentioned together and require them to meet hook for the or a central fora for the U.S. government to discuss these issues and to share resources and to 7. So we set that up. The USMCA is moving forward. It has been established. We are eagerly anticipating and excited to review the report that the deputy petitions and hope that provides clarity for a wide range of stakeholders that are engaged and interested in the forced labor piece of things. So I guess I would conclude by noting a few areas where Congress, where I believe there's a lot of focus moving. Will be the focus of on the task force and making sure that it is fulfilling its statutory mandate. Or there also is a lot of attention on particular instances of forced labor that offices and in the media. Last year, the cocoa trade has received a lot of attention, and certainly there's been a lot of concern on that for decades. And I think there's been a recognition that there are still problems in that space. And also in Xinjiang. The situation in that region of China is deeply, deeply concerning, and forced labor is very prevalent there. So coming up with an effective enforcement strategy is something that is very much on the radar of many offices on the Hill, and is something that I would expect to be focused on, in the coming months. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and turn it to questions if we have time.
Great. Thank you, Keegan. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're pretty busy as well. All of these panelists are extremely busy, and so I'm really, really grateful that all of you took the time to be with us today. There are a number of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to try to answer a couple of very simple ones that I think will. One of them is a comment, which I think is worth sharing with the participants and with our panelists. And the comment is that one of the consequences of finding forced labor or having forced labor in your supply chain is also potential for damage to your brand. And I'm sure that Brian would attest to that's a huge potential consequence, aside from, the legal and regulatory consequences. The business consequence of damage to your brand is pretty important. Another audience member asked for the spelling of Xinjiang, and I'll just spell it if that's okay. That's Xinjiang, Xinjiang. So those are the two easy ones that I decided to take off of the panelists' workload. I do have some other questions that have come in, and there are two that are very related, and I think I would like to ask perhaps a Brian and maybe even Keegan on some thoughts on this, because I think, Keegan, you have a lot of responsibilities to weigh with members and constituents in different areas. So the question is, what level of due diligence is expected when bringing on a new supplier? And then the related question that I think should be maybe considered with this is, what's the expectation for small businesses and what small businesses can do in exercising due diligence? So Brian, maybe you can hit it first, and then I'd ask Keegan to jump in on some thoughts.
Sure, Anna, I'll do my best. So as you ask what level of due diligence, I think you have to begin with what's your level of risk and what's your exposure to the particular type of product you're sourcing, or maybe the region you are sourcing from, because that would determine how deep you should go in determining where there may be potential human rights abuses in your supply chain. Couple of ways we look at it is, when we think about our human rights due diligence practices, we map our supply chain. What are the commodities? What are the products that we're sourcing in, and from what regions? There are a number of resources that I spoke about earlier as well in that appendix, but some of the key ones are the Department of Labor's report on goods produced with child and forced labor, and also Ambassador Richmond's group's report, the Department of State's Trafficking in Persons report. We use these two reports to really identify what are those key commodities that we should be concerned with, and then what are those regions where we should be digging deeper. And if you have a product, or the product you're sourcing is from those countries that are included on the TIP report and or the DLL report, you should go as deep as you can within that supply chain, either starting with a self-assessment questionnaire to understand what sort of practices does your supplier currently employ. And this doesn't mean saying, do you have forced labor in your supply chain? No one in their right mind is going to sit there and answer you that question. It's starting to ask, what sort of policies, what sort of practices do they employ in their employment practices? And then based on what you receive back from that, determine whether or not you have someone to get out there and actually look at the practices and talk to the workers on the ground. And again, it's a manage of balancing the risk with the exposure based on publicly available information and the goods that you're sourcing from that location.
You have reached the maximum time permitted for recording your message. If you're satisfied with the message, press 1.
I was wondering what that was. Can you all hear that as well?
Yeah, I think we're good. It's fine.
Okay. I thought you were.
Do you want to? No, no, you're fine. I think probably we'll go for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll kind of go around and see if anybody has a final comment or thought they'd like to share. But Keegan, did you want to weigh in at all on the issue of due diligence for businesses, as well as what that impact might be for small businesses?
Sure. Happy to jump in. I think I did think that Brian provided a nice framework on due diligence from the company perspective at a more granular level. I think the law does state, if there is forced labor in your supply chain, it should not be imported into the United States. And so I think what that suggests to me is a significant amount of due diligence does need to occur to ensure that would require might be different in different circumstances. But I think I would leave it there.
Okay. Thanks, Keegan. I think you faded out a little bit. There was a question about whether CBP would be issuing regulations to clarify the forced labor provisions and forced labor enforcement. I will tell you that we have been working on updating our regulations. There's a number of regulations that sync up to the issue of forced labor, and we've been working on updating them. We're hopeful that we'll be able to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking in the not too distant future to hopefully provide some updates on our regulations. So the answer is yes, keeping our fingers crossed that happens sooner rather than later. Another question that was raised was, how do you enforce forced labor rules on Section 321? I will just simply answer that once CBP has determined that forced labor exists from a particular entity, then we issue a WRO. And once we've issued a WRO, then we would target against all shipments coming into the United States from that entity, whether they come in the traditional air, land, and sea mode, or through postal express or other means into the United States. And if it's a prohibited good, it's our responsibility to ensure that it doesn't come into the United States. So before we go again for one quick, I'm giving the panelists a little bit of warning that I'll be coming through for a 1-minute wrap-up statement or thought to leave our audience with in wrapping up this panel. I have one question that maybe I'd like to ask James to answer on behalf of DHS is, what is the evidentiary standard to issue a withhold release order?
Thanks, Anna. Actually, I would like to ask you if, given the level of expertise for CBP, but I would like to add on to that once you provide that with respect to some of the information that the public could provide to DHS broadly in finding evidence of forced labor, if I may turn the question in that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope I didn't jump on with my eagerness to answer the question. The statute requires that CBP establish reasonable but not conclusive evidence. And if we do have reasonable suspicion, then we're able to issue a withhold release order. And it's important to clarify that a withhold release order is an internal CBP procedure that is a direction to our ports of entry to detain certain goods. And so we're basically issuing an order to the ports of entry to detain goods that are suspected of being produced with forced labor. Once a suspected shipment arrives, the port of entry will issue a detention notice to that importer who is presenting that shipment for importation. That detention notice will advise them that the goods are being detained in suspected violation of the forced labor statute. And then the importer has 3 months to submit evidence that the goods are either not produced with forced labor, to export the shipment, or to abandon the shipment if they choose to not take any further action with it. If the goods if there's not a resolution within those 3 months, then the goods would be deemed excluded, and the U.S. government would proceed to through our normal seizure and forfeiture procedures. So you wanted to add something, James?
Thanks, Anna. That's exactly I appreciate that high level of detail for everyone to understand. I think noting that the growth of WROs, withhold release orders, in these last 4 to 5 years, I think it was, you can correct me, but I think from 1999 to 2016, we had not issued, or CBP had not issued, collectively the departments, a withhold release order. And we have released quite a few, all things considered, going back since 2016 onward. So these are taken with a great deal of weight by CBP, by the department, obviously with a high level of analysis and a high level of impact. So I really appreciate CBP's efforts in doing that. And my plug is to say, in the midst of all the information that's been provided, it's been referenced by the ambassador. It was referenced by Keegan, referenced by actually all 4 of my fellow panelists. But providing information where you may have signals or information on forced labor. And let me top line by saying DHS only wants information that can be obtained safely. Please don't take this. We don't want anyone to put themselves in danger. But if you see information, if there's imagery, if there's network mapping, supply chain tracing, just information that comes up in the normal course that you're aware of, please do submit that information to the CBP e-allegations portal or to the ICE Homeland Security Investigations tip line, which is a phone number line. But all of this effort that goes into WROs, to information trying to stop forced labor from occurring, often can begin with those types of tips. And so if you're asking yourselves in what ways you can continue to build on participation that Brian's well mentioned that's already occurs in the corporate sector with companies, Keegan's noted as well some of the efforts keenly watched by Congress, but this is one way that anyone can do so when you have that information and our operators are trained to identify signals and signs or take that information and perhaps deem it would not be that way, but just wanted to put that plug in on top of your information on the WROs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And as advised, I will be going around to our panelists and offering you a 1 minute, last thought or point that you'd like to make. We do have a number of different questions that the audience have submitted, and obviously we don't have enough time to answer all of them. We will do our best to follow up with you after the panel and respond to some of those questions. Before I hand it over to the panelists, I wanted to kind of tag on to James's comment about areas that you could go back for additional information. CBP does have an informed compliance guidance document on our website, so you can just use your search engine and look for CBP informed compliance, and you'll be able to find it easily. Another couple of areas of useful information is certainly the Department of Labor's list of goods produced with child and forced labor. They also have a very handy app that they manage, which is the Comply Chain app, which can be very useful for businesses. Certainly the 2020 Trafficking in Persons report is full of great information, and the ILO website has a lot more information on the specifics of forced labor, from a global perspective. So without further ado, James, was there a last thought that you wanted to leave the audience with?
Thank you, Anna. I think I'll just circle back to where I began, that when it comes to Homeland Security, the complexity of what we address, a key element of that, and for securing national security, is in the area of trade and economic security. The goods that come in from a counterfeit nature are certainly a key concern to try to address those types of violations, but in particular, stopping forced labor and stopping in human trafficking, as Sarah mentioned, is critical. And so I want you to just leave with this, that seeking to stop forced labor, seeking to address that level of trafficking is indeed addressing a key matter of Homeland Security, and we all want to be focused on that and in support of those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, how about you?
Thank you, Anna. Well, just to piggyback on some of the questions the audience asked in terms of the level of knowledge and what CBP requires, while you're waiting for CBP to issue that guidance that Anna previewed in her previous remarks, I would again plug our Tariff Act practice guide. And in the practice guide includes an analysis of some of the previously issued WROs and lining them up with the ILO indicators. We've attempted to read the forced labor free tea leaves, essentially. And so hopefully that can give you a little more sense of what CBP is looking for that we were able to analyze to the best of our ability. And I would echo James's comments that, we're again eager to see the government taking robust steps to enforce actions that prevent and go after forced labor in supply chains. And someone had asked, what if we don't know that there's forced labor in our supply chains? And I would counter that you're now on notice that the forced labor is a risk in your production channels. And so just to close, I think on behalf of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and I would also venture to speak for my human rights organization colleagues as well, is that we look forward to the day when companies take forced labor as seriously as they do take bribery. And today, a universe in which forced labor statutes and all the various tools are as powerful as something like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So again, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Brian.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. And thank you for everyone's time today joining us for these 2 hours. I would like to just remind you the documentation I referred to is from the Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee. All of the forced labor working groups recommendations roll through the Intelligent Enforcement Subcommittee. You can find them available on the U.S. Customs website. I'm encouraged by the dialogue today. I think you'll see that there is a strong commitment from the trade to address human rights in our supply chains, as well as just from a general perspective of people, right? I mean, none of us want to see any individuals being treated disrespectfully or abused throughout the production of a product or a service, no matter where they're at. I think in terms of the recommendations we put forward, I think we have to work on, we talk about partnership and trade coming to the table with potential areas where there are issues. There still has to be more attention put around the legal and regulatory framework that offers the protection and more clarity on how we do engage with the government agencies. So I think much of that has been captured in some of the recommendations we put forward in the past through COAC, and we look forward to a continued dialogue on how we can move forward.
Thank you, Brian. And I'd like to also thank Ambassador Richmond, and I think Keegan was disconnected off the line. So I'd like to thank him in absentia as well, and my other three fantastic panelists for your great contributions today. We had over 3,000 participants virtually, and I know that they have benefited from the experience and the knowledge that you have shared with them today. This is a very complex issue, a very complex problem that certainly affects business. And it affects business also from the perspective of the impact that it has on our economy. We know that businesses that use forced labor are unfairly competing with businesses that use decent working practices and respect human rights of workers but can't compete at the same level because they are paying fair market prices for the labor. And so it's a huge concern. The human rights abuses are a huge concern, and it's something that we are very committed to ensuring that we continue to work on eradicating forced labor from our U.S. supply chains. And answering one of the last questions that we have time for, there was a question about whether there are some more withhold release orders coming. And the answer is, of course, there's more withhold release orders coming. We have, unfortunately, there's so much forced labor around the world that our team is working very hard in investigating allegations all over the world. We're very grateful to the NGO community and even the private sector who have given us all of a lot of information with regards to where there may be forced labor in supply chains. And so we're working very hard. We take this very seriously, and we look forward to collaborating and engaging with all of you to ensure that we do our part to eradicate these atrocities in our supply chains. Thank you all again for participating with us. It's been my great pleasure to moderate this panel, and I hope to see you all again soon.